All right, this is Robert Cotto. We're live here with Chris Willems and Jill, right?
Jill Kelly.
Jill Kelly. We're going to talk today a little bit about school funding with my experience in Hartford on the school board and kind of comparing it to what's going on in New Haven. So it's a little bit of an interview, trying something different. So I'll let Chris and Jill, you guys can ask questions and I'll try to answer them the best as possible. And I think the point is for people in Hartford and New Haven to get a sense of how school funding is working and what new changes might be coming that will be similar to what's happening in Hartford now.
Great.
Thank you, Robert. And we wanted to get a sense of what the budgeting was like before the changes that came in 2007, 2008 under Superintendent Adamowski. How were budgeting decisions made prior to the shift?
So just to be clear, my service on the Board of Education begins in 2010, in January of 2010. And when I came in, much of what had been implemented, much of what we're talking about had already been implemented. So like you said, in 2006, 2007, it appears to be a budget process in which people had concerns about the way things were budgeted in Hartford. It looks like the way things were budgeted was very similar to what other towns do. What other towns do is they'll typically tell each school in each district, they'll say, you have, each school is going to get one nurse, one school counselor, one art teacher, 3 to 5 English teachers or elementary level teachers. And it'll depend on different factors like how many students there are, the need for class sizes, et cetera. But usually the district will have some sort of mechanism or formula to say this is how many teachers each school gets. And it's usually based on relevant factors like how many students you have, right? And what the needs are in each building. And so from school to school, you can have differences in the types of teachers. So for example, you may have one school that has 2 bilingual educators and then one school that doesn't because they don't need them, right? Or in one school, you might have a mix of, let's say, older teachers that have been teaching for like 10 to 15, 20 years. And then one school might have younger teachers. But again, the decision-making is based on what the district wants to do in a particular school. So that's generally the way I understand how Hartford school system did budgeting for each school before 2006 and 2007. And it's much like what other suburban school districts, how they budget.
So can you talk a little bit about what informed the decision to change that process towards the weighted student funding model?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors. If you look back at the notes, there's a document called A Guide to Student-Based Budgeting. I just had to look over at it. That was created in 2008, 2009. It's kind of a summary of a task force that they had to decide, what would be the best funding mechanism for the school district. And like I said, there were a couple factors in changing the process of how Hartford budgeted. I would say the first factor was the school district decided that in addition to kind of the interdistrict magnet schools, the whole school district was going to go to an all school choice district, similar to what New Haven has or other places that have these school choice districts. And so there was a recognition from a variety of people, school board members, superintendent, and the community that in order to make that school choice, the school choice process work better for whatever that's worth, there needed to be a different way of funding the schools. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that there was a perception on the part of the community that some schools had more funding than others. So if you looked at the budget back then, you might see one school that has 400 students, their cost or their revenue would be something along the lines of 5 million, but then you could have another school that had a similar bundle of students and needs that had maybe a $7 million price tag. So there was some discrepancies there, and I think we can explain those. But there was a perception that why is one school getting more funding than the other? So you kind of put all those things together, and there was, will and effort to try to figure out what else can be done in terms of how to budget.
But at those two schools that had different levels of funding, they might have had similar levels of staffing. In other words, the experience that the students would be having would be fairly similar. It just cost different.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, Jill, because that's what people, I don't think at the time and still today, when they're talking about these student-based budgeting things, people don't recognize that you can have a school with the same number of students, the same amount of needs, but they may cost different amounts of money because you have one school that may have novice teachers, and so of course their salaries are lower than another school which may have more teachers that are on the experience side. So you're right, it's not like a apples to apples comparison in terms of comparing schools and their cost. And I think that big fact was kind of glossed over when the student-based budgeting process was taking place. And if not glossed over, it was kind of minimized in the analysis of what one school would get compared to another.
So one of the things that we're seeing here in the conversations is that in order to be able to maintain a budget, principals are going to need to make difficult decisions with respect to staffing based on the cost of their staff and how that's going to impact the resources available to the children in that school. Did you find that there were impacts like that in Hartford, where principals were basically making difficult choices between experienced staff and having enough funding to be able to run their existing supports for children?
Yeah, I can get to that. I just wanted to be clear, if I can, just about what the student-based budgeting meant. So maybe we could take like a quick step back.
Sure.
So what student-based budgeting, so like I said, there was this, there's a recognition that if the district was going to go to an all school choice model, and it looked like some schools got more than other schools, then the concept was this idea of student-based budgeting or weighted student funding. And what that meant is that each student, individual student, would get a certain amount of money, let's say, a basic level of like $6,000, plus an additional varying amount of money depending on their needs. So whether they were special education needs or whether they had English language learner needs. So one student could have $7,000 dedicated to them, whereas another student that may have more needs might have $9,000, something along those lines. So that was the idea, and it would look to be portable, right? It would look to be almost like a voucher where each student had a certain amount of money plus any need that they would need, and they could bring that money to any school that they wanted or any school that they could get into, right? Because we know that school choice is much more complicated than just selection of a school. There's a variety of barriers to think about. But that was the basic concept. But if you think about it, it doesn't really work in reality, right? And why doesn't it work in reality? Well, like I said earlier, each school has a different bundle of teachers that are at different salary levels, right? So let's say that you have a group of students that all go to one school and they get $7,000 per student, but they all end up at a school that everyone likes, but the teachers there all are on the higher end of the income scale. When you add up the money for those students, it may not cover all of the costs for those particular teachers within that school, right? And this is one of the concerns about voucher programs, right? That vouchers don't always cover the amount of need at a particular school, right? So the school district did something very, I would say, innovative, but also very problematic. What they did is they said, we're going to do the student-based budgeting thing, but we're going to assume artificially that every school has an average salary for every teacher. So it's a fake. It's kind of just an assumption, but it's fake. It's not real. So they had to assume that each teacher, for example, earns $60,000 or whatever the average is in the school district. Could be 50,000. I don't know what the average is at the moment. And then they would say, okay, so every teacher earns 50,000. So we're kind of on a level playing field in terms of cost. So now every student that brings their $7,000, we'll add that up. And so it'll cover the cost of the average teacher of $5,000 or whatever the number is for the student-based budgeting. That's a big assumption that you have to make, right? Because we know that not all schools have the same experience levels of teachers. And so what that did is it's gotten us into, well, at least I would argue, it's gotten us into some trouble. The numbers on the budget for the Hartford Public Schools, those numbers are kind of an alternative accounting system that assume that each school has an average salary for each teacher, right? So when you look at Hartford School's budget and it says this kid brings $7,000 and the revenue that each school will get is, let's say, $4 million, that's based on an alternate accounting system, and it doesn't reflect the true cost of the teachers, the building, and the instruction in that particular school. So it's kind of it's very unusual. I don't think it's been written about very much. I've brought this up at least over the last 3 years, and you might ask, well, why does this get us into some trouble? Well, what ends up happening is that principals, they use this alternate accounting system, average salary, and then the student-based budgeting number. And what ends up happening at the principal level is they add up all their dollars for each student. And even though they're saying that a salary is average for each teacher, you get something very unusual. Many of the principals find that they don't have enough money for all of the things that they used to be able to provide.
That's
so what ends up happening is, you have a principal at a school with high needs, meaning, let's say they have, 30, 40, 50% English language learners. Maybe they have 25% students with disabilities. And they have to have a certain amount of teachers for each student. They have to have bilingual education to some extent. They have to have special education. And they add up all those dollars in this accounting system, and then they find that they're short. And they can only hire an art teacher rather than an art and a music teacher within this system.
Right.
And so, although on paper, what you told principals was, you guys get to make decisions about how much you're going to spend and what you're going to spend it on. Instead, what ends up happening is it's almost like a game of Survivor or something, where it looks like they've been given less, and they have to then make the decision about what they want to cut, rather than the school district providing the bundle of things you would want in a school, and the bundle of things that you want in a school, and rather than the district having to take responsibility for providing all of those things, now you've shifted it to each school and said, you guys figure it out. We gave you this much money. Now it's your decision to make. And I think from a principal level, again, what I've in conversations with principals is that the magnet school principals that have a little bit of extra from the interdistrict magnet operating grants, they get a little bit more money from the state. They have fewer needs, such as ELL and special education at the magnets, generally speaking. Their decision-making tends to be very different than the non-magnet schools. In other words, the non-magnet schools are talking about, well, should we have one rather than two guidance counselors? Should we have, 1.5 art or one art teacher? And in the other schools, it's like, it's a much more dire situation where they're saying, can we even have art?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the decision making seems to be very different, from school to school. And at the same time, I think it's been really frustrating from a school board person level, because as an individual, as an individual, you're hearing people say, this doesn't add up, this doesn't make sense, you know, my decision making is different than others. And this whole thing was supposed to be more fair, and it doesn't seem like that.
Can I ask a question that's related to the idea that the decisions are being made at the school level? Back when things were made district-wide and policies were set, there was sort of one place to get the information, and if the public or had issues with the budget, right at the Board of Education meetings, everyone can discuss what's going on. When the decisions are made in however many different schools, and they're smaller or lower profile, do you feel that the transparency is actually any good? When you're sitting there in Hartford, do you know what decisions have been made at one particular elementary school, and whether those were good decisions or bad decisions? And if you thought they were bad decisions, could you do anything about them? Or is it so dispersed that you can't keep track of it all?
So, you know, I can't really speculate on every budget decision, but I can say a little bit about the process. So the school district, what they'll say is, here's how much of the pot you have per student, right? They add up how many students that each school's expected to have. And then the principals will generally make like a budget that then they'll share with their school governance council. That's something that, you know, a lot of urban school districts have, a school governance council with parents and teachers and so on and so forth. And so by our policy in Hartford, we require school governance councils, the co-chairs being a parent and a principal, to sign off on the budget, and for the school governance council to vote on the budget. So I don't know about all the details about what decisions have been made exactly. That's kind of, kind of lost within the meetings. You know what I mean? Because there's like 50 different school governance councils, and they're having these individual meetings. However,
that's almost my point.
But we've been able to see. So I get your point, and what I can say is that as a school board, the Hartford school system has collected all of the signature sheets from the school governance council chairs. And so there are years in which we'll get 50 pieces of paper back from the principal and the school governance chair, and half of them won't be signed because the parent may disagree or the principal may disagree that they feel that their budget is not sufficient for their school. We don't have any explanation necessarily of what led them to not sign it and not agree with it. But I think that's from time to time, we've had years where a big chunk of the principals and school governance councils have not signed their individual school budget agreement because they do not believe that what the district is providing is sufficient for those schools. So, we can speculate on, how much, what exact concerns they have. But that's just an indication that not everybody's happy and content with how this thing is working.
So we should probably think about finishing our conversation.
Okay.
Sure.
How are other districts looking to implement this, and how do you think on a global scale as a board member, budget should be done in school districts, in urban school districts specifically?
Hey, Chris, I'm sorry, I lost you there for a minute. Would you mind just repeating your question? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, we focused on the weighted funding model, the student-based budgeting model, and what's impacting urban districts. As a board member, and someone very familiar with urban public schools, what sort of funding system should be in place to ensure that all of our children's needs are met? What would be your recommendation for the kind of budget system that we should have?
Mm-hmm. So I would say every school system is different, and you guys should do what you think is best for your community. But I would say, just have a couple of maybe questions or things to look out for. weighted student funding and student-based budgeting, these models, I think the jury's still out on them, on whether they actually deliver the type of equity and resources that they claim to deliver. I haven't seen it yet in Hartford in terms of delivering educational resource equity. I think more than anything else, the weighting student funding and the school-based budgeting, they provide kind of an illusion of equity, right? This idea of, if we say that every kid gets the same amount of money and we add that up, then that's kind of like equity, but I don't really see it that way. So the way I would see it is, I would ask, does your budgeting system, rather than putting a price tag exactly on each student, which is kind of like a voucher thing, and that's where I think these folks want to go with it, does your budgeting system show you that each kid is getting a similar bundle or group of instructional opportunities, teachers, classes, courses in a school? So in other words, maybe that sounds like going back to the old model of, each school gets, 5 English teachers and 2 art teachers and so on and so forth. Maybe it sounds a little bit like that, but that's what I would want to see in the budgeting process is, if whatever direction that we do, are my kids in this school going to get funded to have, let's say it's a high school, they're going to take algebra, they're going to take geometry, they're going to have access to calculus if they want that, they're going to have all the sciences they need, art, music, social studies, and history. I think that's the type of budgeting process that I'd like to see is, do we have confirmation that the budget will provide for that? I think that's kind of my, part of my criteria of how to do this. And I'll remind you guys that in a place like West Hartford, Connecticut, which is a suburb of Hartford, and probably in other suburbs too, if you look at their budgets, they don't do school by school budgets, right? They don't give you that. They don't do student-based budgeting or weighted student funding. What they're doing is they're budgeting to make sure each school has that particular bundle of things that it needs to have in each school. And if a school has more needs on the special education end or ELL end, they provide that as the district. And last time I checked, this is a school district that's very desirable for people to want to go to. And yes, it's a mostly white district, and I get that it's different. But I guess what I'm saying at the end of the day is that that budgeting process needs to provide those things that every kid ought to get. And so, that would be my criteria, my advice to you guys at the moment.
Yeah, focus on results rather than dollars in.
Yeah, and the thing is, if you want to, talking about inputs into what kids get in terms of this budget, rather than the exact dollar amounts, because each school is going to cost somewhat different. You're going to have some schools that have an older building and they may not be as energy efficient. You may have some schools that have, I don't know if any of your high schools right now have a field house or have a pool, and those buildings are going to cost more to run than a small kind of boutique school that doesn't have those types of things, like a gymnasium, a pool, or a field house. Same with the mix of teachers. You may have a group of teachers that's somewhat older. It doesn't mean that they're better or worse. It just means that they're more experienced and they earn more money along the pay scale. And so, I think those are all part of the mix. And like I said, a place like West Hartford, they're not doing these kind of more exotic urban reforms like the weighted student funding and student-based budgeting, and they're giving their kids, from what I understand, they're giving their kids what they ought to get for the most part, and the results are fairly good. And I think, like I said earlier, the jury's out on student-based budgeting. Are there places that do student-based budgeting or weighted student funding where you can kind of quantitatively and qualitatively say that the kids are doing better, right? So Baltimore, Hartford, these other places, are they doing better because of student-based budgeting or weighted student funding? I don't think that's true. So, you talked about results earlier. I would argue that in Hartford, if anything's getting better in terms of qualitative or quantitative, you know, a lot has to do with it, with investment from the state, from the Chev versus O'Neill case, magnet funding, and that sort of thing. And there's some other factors as well that I've written about. But it's unclear that this is actually doing a whole lot to improve equity.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today and help us to understand some of this, the details around these different funding models.
Yeah,
very helpful.
No problem. And you know, if you want to have a follow-up conversation, I labeled this as discussion 1. So if you guys want to have a follow-up, or you have more information, or if you talk to people in the school district, you know, I think the key is for folks in Connecticut to have these discussions and talk about, you know, what makes sense, particularly because there's only a handful of urban districts that are doing these things, like a Hartford and New Haven and maybe New London, Wyndham. I'm not sure what they're doing now, but you know, we have to ask the question, why is it that the Black and Latino and relatively poor school districts are being asked to do these really unproven and somewhat exotic reforms in terms of school funding, rather than saying that we should be getting the funding from the state and the local and the federal government as well to provide the sorts of educational opportunities that are available in the suburbs. And instead, we're being asked to do these kind of exotic reforms that don't really expand the pie. They just chop it up a little bit differently. So, yes, you know, that's for me where I'm coming from with that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Sorry, I'm just trying to tell you where I'm coming from.
No, it's much appreciated, and we would love to have a follow-up conversation.
All right,
I'd love to do that.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to stop the broadcast, but don't hang up.
Okay.